Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
That sounds good.
Today's deep dive is going to take us to some pretty fascinating and seemingly like completely separate places.
Okay.
We're looking at Edward Bellamy's Utopian novel, looking backward, 1887,
I love that book.
and The Law of One,
Okay.
which is a series of channeled conversations with an entity called Raos.
Right.
And the reason that we're looking at these together is because you, our listener, brought these sources to our attention
That's right.
and wanted us to try to extract some of the most interesting pieces and see if there's any connection between the two.
It's really quite a fascinating request, placing a 19th century vision of like a radically transformed future society
Yeah.
alongside a system of, universal principles that
Right.
supposedly came from a six-density social memory complex.
Right.
So that alone is a testament to the listeners', curiosity and their search for knowledge.
Yeah, and I'm very much intrigued by these sources together.
Yeah.
So just to give everybody a little bit of context in case you're not familiar with one or both of these works,
Here.
in looking backward, you're introduced to this character, Julian West, who falls asleep in 1887 and wakes up in Boston in the year 2000.
I mean, what a way to wake up.
Right. And it's a totally transformed Boston, like beyond recognition.
Yeah.
And Bellamy, he paints a picture of a society that has gotten rid of like all the things that were plaguing a society in the 19th century, so poverty, crime, and all the problems that came from the industrial age.
Right, all the strife.
Right. And the way that he envisions this happening is through this really highly organized, nationalized economic and social system.
Okay.
And so we have some excerpts from the book that talk about Julian's like total shock when he wakes up in this new world.
Yeah.
And then how he kind of gets brought up to speed on how this new world works and their solutions to the labor issues that were happening in the 19th century, how they make sure that intellectual workers still have a place. And then also there's some reflections on the way that the 19th century capitalist system was working and the ways that it was failing, both from an efficiency standpoint and a moral standpoint.
Right. So it's not just a technological utopia, it's also a moral utopia that he's presenting.
Right. And so that's looking backward.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, we have the Law of One.
Right.
And so for anyone who's not familiar with the Law of One, it's this really complex cosmology, and it's all centered around this principle that all things are one.
Right. That's the Law of One.
Right. And it's through this series of questions and answers with this entity, Ra.
Who is Ra?
So Ra is, I guess the best way to describe it is a six-density social memory complex.
Okay. And just for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the Law of One, when we talk about a six-density social memory complex, we're talking about a group consciousness that has reached this like really, really high level of connection and understanding.
Yeah. So basically like a super evolved, unified consciousness.
Right. Exactly.
And so through these conversations with Raf, they touch on all these different topics. So like the nature of reality, what is consciousness really about?
Okay.
How does consciousness evolve through these different densities?
Right, because in the Law of One, there's this idea that, we as humans are in third density, and then there's all these higher densities, and that like our goal is to move up through those densities.
Right, it's almost like levels of spiritual development.
Okay.
And they talk about free will and the idea that there's this polarity between service to self and service to others.
So that's like, are you acting in a way that's just benefiting yourself, or are you trying to act in a way that benefits everyone?
Exactly. And then they talk about this concept of harvest, which is basically like graduating to these higher densities, and it gets even weirder from there.
Weirder.
Well, they talk about things like UFOs and ancient history, and even like what the pyramids were really all about.
Wow. Okay, so this is a really wide range of information.
Right. So we're going to be looking at excerpts from books I3, 4, and V.
Okay, so a lot to cover.
Yeah. So I think at this point, anybody listening is probably like, wait a minute, what could these two things possibly have in common?
Right. One is speculative fiction. One is supposedly channeled wisdom.
Right. Exactly. Like, how do you even begin to compare these?
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to do today.
Right. I'm excited.
Yeah. So we're going to be looking at these sources together and seeing if there are any surprising parallels or even, interesting contrasts between the two.
And just to reiterate, we're not trying to say that one is right and one is wrong, or that you have to believe either of them. It's really just about exploring the ideas and seeing what we can learn.
Exactly. Yeah. All about understanding the core ideas that they're presenting and then seeing what happens when we put them side by side.
Right, because even if they seem completely different on the surface, maybe there's some underlying connection, or maybe they're asking similar questions in different ways.
Right, or maybe they're both responding to the same, like, fundamental problems in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what does it mean to be human? What is the purpose of society, and how do we move forward?
Right, and so maybe by looking at these two very different perspectives, we can gain some new insights into those really big questions.
I'm ready to dive in.
Okay, so let's start by comparing the societal visions that are presented in these two works.
Okay.
So in looking backward, like I said, it's this future Boston where they have completely eradicated economic inequality.
Wow.
And the way they've done that is through nationalizing all industry.
Okay, so everything is owned and operated by the government.
Right. And Bellamy, he really emphasizes how this eliminates competition, which he saw as being really wasteful and a big source of conflict in the 19th century.
Interesting. So it's almost like he sees competition as this inherent evil.
Right. And so instead of competition, everything is based on cooperation, and everyone is working together for the common good.
And does this actually work in the book? Like, does he present it as being successful?
Yeah, he does. He actually uses the phrase prodigious increase of efficiency to describe how well this new system works.
So he's saying that not only is it more morally sound, but it's also more efficient.
Right. And he even points out that even people who might be considered like victims of this system in the sense that they lost their individual wealth and power.
Right, because if everything is nationalized, then presumably the really wealthy people would lose a lot.
Right. But he even points out that even those people had to admit that the new system was just objectively better in terms of how well it functioned.
So it's like he's trying to preempt any arguments against his system by saying, look, even the people who you think would be against it have to admit that it works.
Right. And so now I want to bring in the law of one, because even though it's coming from a completely different perspective, the law of one also talks a lot about the idea of unity and service.
Right, because the fundamental principle of the law of one is that everything is one.
Right. And so when you think about Bellamy's solution, in looking backward with its emphasis on cooperation and the common good,
Right.
does that resonate at all with what Ray is talking about in the law of one?
I mean, it definitely does in the sense that both seem to be aiming towards a similar end goal, which is this kind of harmonious state where everyone is working together.
Right.
But I think the way they get there is very different.
Okay, how so?
Well, Bellamy's system is very much like top-down, right? It's all about creating this perfect system on a societal level, and then everyone kind of slots into that system.
Okay.
Whereas the law of one is much more about individual choice and how those individual choices ultimately lead to either separation or unity.
Okay, so you're saying that in Bellamy's vision, the unity is imposed from the outside.
In a way, yes. And I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. It's just that it's coming from the structure of the society itself.
Right.
Whereas in the law of one, the unity comes from within each individual. It's about making the choice to serve others and to recognize that we're all connected.
And so that choice to serve others is what ultimately leads to these higher densities.
Exactly. And so I think that's a key difference between the two perspectives.
Right, because in looking backward,
Yeah.
everyone is kind of forced into this system whether they like it or not.
Right. Whereas in the law of one, you have free will. You can choose to serve yourself or you can choose to serve others. And that choice determines your path.
And that brings us to this really interesting point that's brought up in the law of one about third density.
Okay.
So third density is where humanity currently is. And one of the defining characteristics of third density is this choice between service to self and service to others.
Right. And Ray talks about how at the end of a cycle, entities are basically separated based on the choices they've made.
Right, so the people who have chosen service to self go one way, and the people who have chosen service to others go another way.
Right. And he uses this phrase, separated by their own choice, into the vibratory distortion most comfortable to their mind-body-spirit complexes.
Right, so it's not like somebody is judging you and sending you one way or the other. It's more like you are naturally drawn to the path that aligns with your choices.
Exactly. And so when you look at Bellamy's vision of this completely unified society,
Right.
it's interesting to think about how that aligns with this idea of individual choice and this sort of natural separation that happens based on vibration.
Right, because In Bellamy's world, everyone is unified on a societal level.
Right, but we don't really know what's happening on an individual level in terms of their choices and their vibrations.
So it's possible that even within this perfectly unified society, you could still have people who are vibrating at different levels.
Exactly. And so maybe that raises the question of, can you really achieve true societal harmony if you don't have some level of inner alignment as well?
Right, so it's almost like Bellamy is addressing the external symptoms.
And Ra is addressing the root cause.
Exactly. And so that's a really interesting contrast to keep in mind as we go forward.
For sure.
So another thing that Bellamy really emphasizes, looking backward, is this idea of equal opportunity in education.
Okay.
So in his future Boston, everyone receives the same education up to a certain point.
Okay.
And then after that, they have the freedom to choose whatever profession they want based on their natural inclinations and their interests.
That sounds pretty ideal, right?
Yeah, and the idea is that this would allow people to do what they're best at and what they enjoy the most.
Which would presumably lead to a more productive and fulfilling society.
Right, and so everyone would be contributing in a way that feels meaningful to them.
And so everyone benefits.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this idea of like inherent talents or abilities,
Yeah.
it also comes up in the Law of One.
Really? How so?
Well, Ra talks about these beings called wanderers.
Oh, okay. I've heard of those.
So wanderers are basically higher density beings who have chosen to incarnate into third density.
So they're like volunteers coming to help humanity.
Right, and one of the things that Ross says about wanderers is that they often come in with specific pre-incarnative talents.
Okay, so like they chose to be born with certain skills or abilities that would help them in their mission.
Exactly, and so it's interesting to see this parallel between Bellamy's vision of a society that tries to identify and utilize people's natural talents,
Yeah.
and Ra's idea of these wanderers coming in with pre-incarnative talents to help humanity.
It's almost like they're both talking about the same thing, but from different angles.
Right, and I think it's also interesting to think about the motivation behind these talents in each case.
Okay.
So in Bellamy's world, the focus is very much on optimizing society, making it as efficient and productive as possible.
Right.
And so the individual talents are seen as a way to achieve that.
Okay.
But with the Wanderers, it's more about service and helping others to evolve.
Right, because they're not doing it for personal gain. They're doing it out of a sense of compassion and a desire to help.
Right. And so again, we see this interesting contrast between the material focus in Bellamy's work.
And the spiritual focus in the Law of One.
Right. And I think this is a good point to bring in one of the most striking excerpts from Looking Backward.
Okay.
So Bellamy, he was really critical of what he called the mercenary considerations of the 19th century.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Basically, he's talking about how in the 19th century, people were often forced into jobs that they were completely unsuited for simply because they needed the money.
Right, they had to do whatever it took to survive.
Exactly. And Bellamy, he saw this as being a huge waste of human potential and a major source of unhappiness.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense if you're spending your whole life doing something you hate, it's not going to be a very fulfilling life.
Right. And he contrasts this with his future society, where people are free to choose their professions based on their interests and their talents.
So there's no economic pressure forcing them into jobs they don't want.
Exactly. And so when I read this, I couldn't help but think about the Law of One in Ra's, and Ra's constant emphasis on the importance of purity of intention.
Okay.
Because one of the things that Ra talks about is how your intentions really matter in terms of your spiritual progress.
Right. It's not just about what you do, it's about why you do it.
Exactly. And so if
Yeah.
you're doing something purely out of a desire for money or power,
Right.
Ra would say that that's not going to be as beneficial for your spiritual growth as if you're doing something out of a genuine desire to serve others.
So it's almost like Bellamy's future society is accidentally creating the conditions for greater spiritual growth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Bellamy was thinking about it in those terms, but it's interesting to look at it through that lens.
Right, because by removing those mercenary considerations, he's essentially creating a space where people are more free to act from their heart.
Right, and to pursue what truly resonates with them.
Which could then lead to greater spiritual awareness, even if that wasn't the intended goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's a really fascinating connection, I think, between these two seemingly different perspectives.
Yeah, that's...
Another thing that Bellamy talks about in Looking Backward is the problem of credit and financial instability.
Okay.
So he describes the 19th century system of credit as building a house with dynamite for mortar.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Right, and basically he's saying that the whole system was built on this foundation that was inherently unstable.
And prone to collapse.
Right, and he points to things like overproduction, and the resulting unemployment as evidence of this instability.
Okay.
And so he contrasts that with his future society, where production is carefully aligned with demand.
So no more overproduction, no more unemployment.
Right, and he sees this as being one of the key reasons why his future society is so stable and prosperous.
It sounds very utopian, right?
Yeah, and so I think this is another point where we can bring in the law of one, and specifically Ra's teachings about the nature of reality.
Okay.
So Ra talks a lot about how our perception of reality is actually an illusion.
Right. That's a common theme in a lot of spiritual teachings.
Right, and he
Right.
talks about how there are these veils between our conscious mind and our unconscious mind that prevent us from seeing the true nature of things.
Okay.
And so when you think about the economic anxieties that Bellamy is describing,
Right.
do you think those could be seen as a manifestation of this illusory nature of reality?
I mean, it's definitely possible, right? Because if you're caught up in this cycle of overproduction and unemployment, and you're constantly worried about money,
Right. It's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture.
and to get caught up in the illusion that this is all real and that your survival depends on it.
Right. And so from Ray's perspective, maybe the solution is to start piercing those veils and seeing through the illusion.
And recognizing that there's something more beyond this material reality.
Right. And maybe Bellamy's future society, with its emphasis on stability and abundance,
Yeah.
could be seen as a step in that direction.
Like a kind of societal attempt to create a less illusory experience.
Exactly. And so, again, we see this really interesting connection between these two seemingly different perspectives.
Yeah, it's like they're both addressing the same underlying problem, but from different angles.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that makes this comparison so fascinating.
For sure.
So another big theme that I wanted to touch on is this idea of progress,
Okay.
because both Bellamy and Ra talk about progress, but they define it in very different ways.
Right. Bellamy is talking about societal progress, whereas Ra is talking about spiritual progress.
Exactly. And so it's interesting to think about whether there's any overlap between those two concepts.
Right, because maybe they're both ultimately aiming towards the same thing, which is a better state of being.
Right. And so maybe the question is, what does it actually mean to progress as a society or as an individual?
And are those two things even separate, or are they interconnected?
Right. Because maybe you can't have true societal progress without some level of individual spiritual growth.
Or maybe societal progress can create the conditions that are necessary for spiritual growth,
Right. And so I think that's a really important question for us to consider.
especially as we move forward into the future.
And I think this is a good point to bring in one of the most intriguing aspects of Bellamy's vision,
Okay.
which is his idea of eventual world unification.
Okay.
So Bellamy, he believed that the logical endpoint of societal evolution was a single, unified, global society.
Wow. So like a one world government.
Right, and he saw this as being the most efficient and beneficial way to organize humanity.
Interesting.
And he argued that it would eliminate things like war and poverty.
Because everyone would be working together towards common goals.
Exactly, and so when I read this, I couldn't help but think about the law of one and the idea of universal oneness.
Right. Because if everything is one, then it makes sense that eventually we would all come together as one society.
Right, and so maybe Bellamy's vision of world unification can be seen as a kind of societal manifestation of this underlying cosmic unity.
That's a really cool way to look at it.
And I think it's a reminder that even though these two sources come from such different places,
Yeah.
they might actually be pointing towards similar truths.
Right. And so maybe by looking at them together, we can start to see the connections between the material and the spiritual.
Exactly, and I think that's really what this deep dive has been all about.
Oh, sure.
So there's one last point from Bellamy's work that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up,
Okay.
and it's his view on the role of women in society.
Okay.
So Bellamy, he envisioned a future where women had their own separate sphere.
Separate from men.
Right, so they would have their own careers and ambitions, and they wouldn't be directly competing with men.
Okay.
And his reasoning for this was that he felt like the passional attraction between the sexes
Okay.
often got in the way of true understanding and collaboration.
So he's saying that men and women are fundamentally different and they need their own spaces to thrive.
Right. And so I found this really interesting because it seems to contrast with Ra's emphasis on balance.
Right, because Ra talks a lot about the importance of balancing your energy center.
Right. And that applies to everyone regardless of gender.
Exactly. And so from Ra's perspective, maybe the solution isn't to separate men and women,
Right.
but rather to help them both achieve greater inner balance so they can work together more effectively.
Right. And so it's almost like Bellamy is saying that we need to recognize and accommodate our differences
And Ra is saying that we need to transcend our differences and focus on what unites us.
Exactly. And so I think that's a really fascinating tension to consider.
For sure.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close,
Yeah,
I think it's safe to say that we've covered a lot of ground.
we have.
And I hope that our listeners have found this exploration to be as thought-provoking as we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing how two sources that seem so different on the surface
Right.
can actually have so much in common when you dig a little deeper.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that both Bellamy and Ra
Yeah.
are ultimately pointing towards a better future for humanity.
Right, even though they have very different ideas about how to get there.
Right. And I think both of them recognize that the way we're doing things now
Right.
isn't working.
Exactly. And so even if you don't agree with everything that Bellamy or Ra says,
Right.
I think there's a lot of value in just considering their perspectives and thinking about what we can learn from them.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah. So thank you so much to our listener for suggesting these sources.
Yes, thank you.
This has been a really amazing exploration.
And to all of our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and to see what other connections you might uncover,
And let us know what you find.
right? Because we're always learning and growing.
That's the point of the deep dive.
Exactly.
Ah,
So until next time, keep diving.
and keep questioning.
And we'll see you on the other side.
Safe travels.
Bye.